Welcome back, everyone. Today on Cityline, we are diving deep into motherhood. And in this next segment, we're going back to the beginning. Giving birth can be one of the most significant occasions in a person's life. But the amount of information about the experience can be both overwhelming, too much information, but most often not enough. So we've invited three wonderful mamas to share the beautiful and ugly truth about childbirth. And trust me, it can get ugly. Welcome to Sarah, Nicole Landry, Tanya Hales, and Corey Shearstone. So good to have all of you with us. Sarah, you've done this 4 times, girl. Tell us about your birth stories and how different they were from each other.
They are so different. And every time we talk about our birth stories, it feels like we're exchanging currency between birthers, right? It's such an experience. And my first one happened when I was 21 and I gave birth to my daughter with no experience. I went to 0 classes. I just thought I've seen movies, it'll be fine. And was very shocked by the entire experience. I was in labor for 18 hours. I pushed for 2 hours and ended up with an episiotomy and a year long of healing. So I was disgusted by the entire experience, was very surprised by it all. So going into my second, I thought I was a bit more prepared. And, the first time I'd had an epidural, loved her. And the second time, my epidural didn't work. What a shock that it can sometimes not work. Nobody had ever told me that could happen, or that you might be waiting hours for an anesthesiologist. So into my third one, he was a week late. We ended up failing a non-stress test, and they broke my water to get me to have this baby. And I immediately ordered that epidural thinking if I get it on time, I'll be good to go. And again, for the third time, it didn't work. And my body went into shock after birth, and I couldn't hold him for some time. It was really alarming. But at the same time, I was like, well, I'm done having kids. This is the end. And now a whole decade later, last year I gave birth to my 4th child. And this time I fell into pregnancy complications. I had prenatal depression, and I started therapy only to discover that all of these little bits of trauma from those first births and that unpredictability and that feeling of loss of control was contributing to a really severe depression and anxiety about giving birth. So working with a therapist was huge. And I ended up creating 4 birth plans. One that was for a home birth, because we were in a pandemic and that was an option that I had on the table. The second was for a hospital birth without epidural, third with an epidural, and fourth, a C-section. So that at every moment I felt really advocated for, and like I had a semblance of what control could look like, and that there was less shock and awe throughout the whole process. I also really leaned into social media. That was something I didn't have access to in the earlier births. And I started following a lot of birthing pages, birthing photography. We'd been taught to be so disgusted by birth, and that's how I felt in the first ones, that this time I leaned so far into it. I leaned into that pain. I leaned into every bit of it. Ended up having a amazing, best birth I've ever had, at home in a birthing tub with my family surrounding me. And it was opposite of anything I've ever experienced before. It was truly disgusting. And that was the most beautiful part of it.
That's right. You got to lean into the grossness of it all, because it is gross. I remember thinking when I had my first kid, how are we still doing this barbaric act in the 2000s, like pushing a human out of a hole that small? But that's what it's all about. It's what we do. So like a lot of moms, Tanya, you had a tough time with postpartum pooping and breastfeeding. Gross things that many of us go through. Tell us more about your experiences.
Yeah, so during labor, I actually had a 3rd-degree tear as a result of my son coming out of me too fast. So I wasn't pooping partly because I couldn't, all the drugs in you from the epidural, etc., but also just the fear. I didn't want to tear any worse. And so I wasn't going. I did the stool softeners, the drinking of the prune juice, all that stuff. And when it came out, no word of a lie, it was the size of like a grapefruit. It was pain like no other I've ever experienced, because it was like giving birth all over again through the other hole without the drugs. So that was one part of childbirth that, no one ever talks about postpartum poops. And then breastfeeding, we watch the movies, the TV shows. We think we're going to put them on, they're going to latch, and everything's going to be magically delicious. And it absolutely is not. It took us 3 months. I had public health nurse come in. I went to breastfeeding clinic. I went back to the hospital. I really suffered. It was like a sharp stabbing pain in my boobs every single time he ate. He was flourishing. He was great. He had his proper outputs, but I wasn't like, it was really a struggle for me. And so one day he latched on differently, and I was like, oh, like the wave of relief that came over me when he was able to latch properly, and we were able to have a proper, lovely experience after that.
This is why people need to leave moms alone, because I remember the feeling of rage I would get when my husband would come to me and say, well, he's hungry. It's like, he's hungry? Do you know how much it hurts? Like, it is major pain. So thank you for being honest about that. It's really, really tough for a lot of us. What about you, Corey? What are the things you were never told about childbirth that every woman out there just needs to know?
Well, I'm high anxiety with a dash of doctor phobia. So I chose to be induced. And the reason that I chose to be induced is because they said it would lessen the likelihood that I would end up needing to have a C-section. So when you go to be induced, it's like you're at the top of a roller coaster. Like, okay, here we go. It's going to happen. You get in the bed, legs in the stirrups, ready to go. The front half of the bed, it folds down. The doctor comes in and turns on the lights. And I kid you not, it was like something out of a football stadium. I was not expecting it at all. I couldn't believe the scenario. And if you have a little bit of stage fright and it's all focused down there, like, oh my goodness. But you get over it fast. You're like, okay, I'm calm. It's all good. Like, you need them to see the baby down there. And then, fast forward, they've got this balloon. And that's how they do the induction, or at least that's how they did my induction. And the balloon, it's thin, it's narrow, and it's something a clown would have at a birthday party. Very unexpected. They work that into your cervix, and they blow it up with saline. Now you've got this pressure sitting there. And although some women wear the balloon overnight, I did not. You just kind of bounce around, hang out, and then all of a sudden, this balloon pops out of you, and you least expect it, and the nurse cleans it up nicely, and you keep going about your business. Now, I always knew that I was going to have an epidural, and as Sarah alluded to, you have to know when your anesthesiologist is going to be available to you. So when they came in, I thought, I can go a little bit longer, but wait, when are you going to be available to come back? Best advice ever. The anesthesiologist says, I'm going to be gone for 2 hours in surgery, and I'm like, okay, give me the drugs. Give me all the drugs. And then fast forward, you're in active labor, you're wearing the tummy monitor so that you can see the baby's heart rate. All of a sudden, he's not doing so great. So they're like, you know what, we're going to get out the vacuum. The vacuum is like a suction cup for their head. And it's not that frightening until they take it and they go down there with it. And there's no squeezing like a menstrual cup. There's no like squishing. Like, that's what's going on down there. So I'm trying to block these thoughts out of my mind. Ultimately, they vacuumed him out. He was okay. I did have a vaginal tear, but ultimately, I didn't find that to be the worst part. The worst part was the pelvis popping, as he had to work his way through that area. And although I had an epidural, I could still feel some of it. Then afterwards, they give you this little bad boy that I still have as a collector item to clean down there. And I will say, if you have a bidet, you're already ahead. Fast forward, you want to take a sitz bath. Oh my goodness, best thing my friend recommended. It sits in the bed of your toilet, and you can put some Epsom salts in there. Very relaxing and very good for the tears. So I'm very glad that someone told me about it.
Oh, it's a beautiful thing, that sitz bath. Oof. Sarah, before we go, are there bits that are still considered taboo and not spoken of enough, according to you?
Yeah, in terms of not spoken of enough is just that advocacy for yourself through the process. One big example that was said to me by my prenatal instructor was, we were just doing some comparatives between like home and in hospital, and just how much we ask permission to do things. Can I go to the bathroom? Can I do this? If you wouldn't ask that in your own home, then don't be asking it in one scenario, especially at a time of really great need. Obviously, there's some nuances to this, especially with different monitors and systems, but really making sure that you are very aware that this is somebody's everyday job. Your support people, this is their everyday job, and this is the biggest day of your life. So you've got to be very clear on your needs at every moment and don't feel bad about them. And yes, there's going to be a lot of disgusting stuff, gross stuff that happens along the way. Things like pooping when you give birth, very normal. Let's not make it a thing. Let's just recognize that it's a huge part of the process. Things like when your milk comes in, it actually doesn't come out of a singular hole, but like a shower sprayer. Such a shock. The thing is with censorship and stuff on social media is we don't get to see what maybe a mucus plug looks like when we first go into labor. We need to start sharing these stories with each other and really exchanging them as basic information so that people can come into these situations not with fear and disgust, but to understand truly how magical we are, and we're these like human portals for another being. That's so magical. If you poop on the table while doing it, so what? At the end of the day, it's all good, and lean into all of that discomfort and how and lean into that pain. This is the one time in your life that pain truly serves a purpose. So just go after it. It's such an honor truly to be able to share these experiences and talk about these things and not have it be so taboo.
I can't hear birth stories without putting folks who birth on such a pedestal, because it's just an incredible to hear about it. I've gone through it a couple of times, and hearing your stories, I'm like, oh my gosh, oh yeah, it's a big deal. So thank you all for being so candid with us today. All of it, the poop, the breast, the balloon, and the cervix, we love it.